Well, let's get going. I'm John Henry, chairman of the Committee for the Republic. Voltaire is regularly quoted as saying, having said, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. But no nation honors that free speech aspiration. Censorship is a sidekick to the drive for power. Speech that threatens the prevailing authorities is invariably suppressed. The speaker is ostracized. The truth emerges, if ever, only after its threat to the existing establishment has passed. Examples are endless. Galileo challenged the Roman Catholic Church. His writings were placed on the index of forbidden books for nearly 2 centuries. Abolitionist literature in the South was banned until slavery ended. The true cause of the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor was not accepted until many decades later. The racist World War II concentration camps for 120,000 Japanese Americans were not acknowledged by the United States Supreme Court for 74 years. Tonight's speakers verify there's nothing new under the sun. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Ted Postol, a highly credentialed MIT professor, assembled dispositive scientific evidence discrediting the claim of the United States government that Syria's President Assad had used chemical weapons against his opponents. The claim was born of the United States government's need for an excuse to initiate war in the hopes of effectuating regime change, as it had done in Libya. The calamity that followed the ouster and death of Gaddafi did not daunt Washington. God rationed intelligence, but left foolishness without limit. War for the sake of war is the marching song of all empires. Ted's speaking truth to power predictably provoked retaliation, ad hominem attacks, and suppression by the established media, which is in bed with the military-industrial complex. MIT receives hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funds annually. To paraphrase Upton Sinclair, it's difficult to get a university to understand something when their financing depends on it not understanding it. Ted was lucky. A courageous reporter from a non-mainstream publication, Jeremy Kuzmarov of the Covert Action magazine, has disseminated Ted's scientific findings on the false flag operations. Jeremy was startled at how obvious Ted's findings were, even to a layman, and the hesitancy and the resistance of the mainstream media, which is a megaphone for our imperial policy. The two will heighten your skepticism of what passes as mainstream gospel. I'll now hand it over to Jeremy and Ted. I think they've agreed that Jeremy's going to lead. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and it's really an honor to be here. Yeah, so I'll speak for about 10 minutes, and then Ted is going to follow up. On August 20th, my talk's entitled American Regime Change in Syria. On August 20th, 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry gave a dramatic press conference in which he affirmed the U.S. intelligence community's assessment that chemical gas attacks had been carried out in eastern Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus, by the Bashir Al-Assad government of Syria. The Obama administration used the attacks to justify Operation Timber Sycamore, a $1 billion program supplying arms to jihadist rebels seeking to overthrow Assad and to push for airstrikes, which were called off because Congress and the public made clear that they did not want them. 4 years later, in April 2017, the Trump administration alleged that the Assad regime had carried out sarin gas attacks in the town of Khan Sheikhoun in Syria's Idlib province. These attacks were used as a basis for the Trump administration to launch 59 cruise missiles against the Syrian government's airbase at Shayrat. Ted Postol, as John pointed out, is a weapons expert based at MIT with a long record of exposing false government claims about the success of various weapon systems. He studied with various collaborators the alleged chemical attacks in Syria using science-based calculations and forensic supercomputer simulations. He and his colleagues determined that in the Eastern Ghouta attack, sarin-carrying bomb barrel rockets that delivered the sarin gas could only propel each heavy sarin-filled steel barrel to a range of 2 to 2.5 kilometers, about 1.5 miles. However, the map issued in the White House intelligence report showed that the attack could only have come from Syrian government-controlled areas if the rockets had a range of more than 10 or more kilometers. This meant that the data from the White House intelligence report instead indicates that barrel rockets could only have been launched from inside rebel-controlled areas rather than from areas controlled by Syrian government forces. For the Khan Sheikhoun attack, Postol and his collaborators determined that the crater allegedly caused by the sarin gas bomb and related fragments was caused by an improvised rocket-propelled artillery round with a high explosive warhead, which the rebel forces are known to possess, and not by an aerial bomb from a Syrian airplane. Tampering with the scene and a lack of basic knowledge about the lethality of sarin by the journalism community led to misreporting of factual information that was in plain sight. Sarin could not actually have been deployed because workers at the scene would have been seriously injured or killed if they were exposed. Injuries from toxic gas exposure was instead from the bombing of an agricultural supply store elsewhere in Khan Sheikhoun, which was being used as a munitions depot by local rebel forces, along with fertilizers, insecticides, and other agricultural goods, and released toxic chemicals when struck. In spite of the clear and rigorous science-based evidence in Postol's articles, which have been confirmed in numerous other independent assessments, including by the UN itself, the UN study, he has faced tremendous pushback accompanied by numerous slanderous personal attacks, unaccompanied by any scientific evidence. In the case of Khan Sheikhoun, the editors of the prestigious scientific journal, the Princeton-based Science and Global Security, withdrew the piece after it had already been accepted and was in page proof. Their decision was prompted by a letter they had received from Dr. Gregory Koblenz, a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at George Mason University's Shore School of Public Policy, which smeared Postol as a conspiracy theorist and crank, and even referred to him as a Holocaust denier, or compared him to Holocaust deniers. Previously, Postol had been attacked by Elliot Higgins, founder of Bellingcat, a UK-based research agency supported by the US National Endowment for Democracy, which advances disinformation about countries targeted for regime change like Syria and Russia. Higgins's credibility was undercut by the fact that he was a college dropout who never set foot in the Middle East and admitted that his knowledge of weapons was on the level of, this is his quote, your average Xbox owner. Everything he knew, he told the reporter, came from Rambo and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yet somehow Higgins was the go-to expert in mainstream news publications. And somehow his attacks on Postol, which were often quite vicious, were taken seriously by these publications. The attempt to suppress Postol's findings and smear a scientist with a long record of successfully exposing past government frauds reflects on the erosion of functioning democracy in the United States today and advent of a new McCarthyism. Under this new McCarthyism, or some would call it Stalinism, critics of government claims are not accused of being communists, but rather being mentally unstable and deranged conspiracy theorists or cranks, and effectively blacklisted like their forebears. The chemical weapons attacks in Syria appear to be a classic example, has been pointed out, of misreporting by US intelligence agencies, either error or black flag deceptive operation. These recent events are comparable to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, sinking of the USS Maine, and the Iraq WMD fiasco. In each case led to major wars. They were designed to provide a pretext for US military intervention, in this case in Syria. As an extension of the Black Flag campaign, the human rights abuses of Syrian leader Bashir Al-Assad have consistently been played up when the US government supports among the Middle East's worst human rights offenders, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and rebel forces in Syria. Syria had been targeted for regime change because the Assad dynasty had been hostile to Western economic interests, is allied with Iran, and is an open enemy of Israel, and not because of any legitimate security threat to the United States. Reuters correspondent Patrick Seal wrote in the 1980s that Syria was viewed by the Reagan administration as, quote, the enemy, the most militant of Israel's neighbors, the closest to Moscow, the only substantial obstacle to US designs for the region. This has changed very little today. When the late Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld developed a list of 6 countries targeted for regime change after 9/11, Syria was high on the list, just below Iran, which was the ultimate target. From 1970 to 2000, Syria was ruled by Hafez al-Assad, Bashir's father. He was part of the secular Ba'ath Party, which stressed the need for rejuvenation of the Arab nations against threats and humiliations by Western imperial powers, and adopted a state-centered model of economic development. Syria had been colonized by France and was subjected to numerous CIA-backed coups in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, with some of the same coup plotters in the famous and better-known coup of Iran of 1953, like Kermit Roosevelt, that overthrew democracy in Iran, and Mohammad Mossadegh were then sent to Syria to try and effect regime change there. After that, Assad took over, and he restructured Syria's security forces into a new coup-proof system that was harsh, but allowed Syria to retain its sovereignty since 1970. A July 1986 declassified CIA document outlined the US strategy in Syria that was hostile to Assad, as it remains. The document stated that, in our view, US interests would be best served by a Sunni regime controlled by business-oriented moderates. Assad is Shia Alawite. Business moderates would see a strong need for Western aid and investment to build Syria's private economy, thus opening the way for stronger ties to Western governments. The report acknowledged that the collapse of the Ba'athist state presided over by Assad could help to empower religious zealots seeking to establish an Islamic republic, but this was a risk that Washington was willing to take. 20 years later, the charge d'affaires at the US Embassy in Damascus, William Roebuck, in a leaked diplomatic cable, referred to the threat to the Assad regime from Islamic extremists as, quote, an opportunity that the US should take to try, should take action to try to increase. Roebuck also pushed for better coordination with Egypt and Saudi Arabia in provoking sectarian divisions by exaggerating Iranian influence, along with a rumor campaign against Assad and arming of the Kurds as part of a destabilization strategy, which was implemented under President Obama and continued under President Trump. The Arab Spring uprising that began in Syria in March 2011 was dominated by Islamic fundamentalists who had provided a main source of opposition to Assad since 1970 and had led a major uprising in 1982 in Hama that Hafez Assad had crushed. The US had a history, its policy in Syria was similar to other countries. The US had a history of supporting Islamists as an alternative to secular nationalists like the Assads or socialists or communists. Examples include Egypt and Indonesia in the 1950s and 60s, Afghanistan in the 1980s, Bosnia in the 1990s, and Libya, both before and after the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. The Free Syrian Army, favored by the United States, according to Foreign Policy magazine, was a Turkish-backed proxy force with ties to extremist groups and was responsible for, quote, killing scores of unarmed civilians. An offshoot, the Khalid ibn al-Walid Brigade, broadcast the beheading of unarmed prisoners on the internet. One of its commanders vowed that, quote, the jihadists will wash the filth of the Rafta, a slur for Shiites from Greater Syria. They will wash it forever if Allah wills it. According to A.B. Abrams, author of a book I can recommend called World War in Syria, published by Clarity Press, the Obama era saw the maturing of information warfare capabilities, whose purpose was to convince the public of the righteousness of the U.S. cause of regime change in Syria. The media were crucial to this war, as with the effort to attack and smear people like Ted Postol, who challenged the government's narrative through hard facts and science. The people discussed earlier, Koblenz, Higgins, and the others who attacked Ted, were agents of disinformation and this information war. The truth means nothing to these people. Their prominence in society displays how the US has evolved into more of an authoritarian state in the age of the war on terror. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ted now, who's going to show some slides.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks very much for your very interesting remarks. I'd like to follow up with a short, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to follow up with a short presentation that focuses on my findings about the intelligence that was given to President Obama following the nerve agent attack in Damascus on August 21, 2013. I'll show that the intelligence given to the president was completely wrong and misled him and the White House staff into considering unjustified military action against the Syrian government. This could have involved the US in yet another Middle East war, and it could have resulted in a military confrontation with Russia and a possible takeover of Damascus by ISIS. I can discuss that later if need be. I'll start by showing you a video of Secretary of State John Kerry testifying before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. He was seeking authority from the Senate to take military action against the Syrian government. Once the video is finished, I'll then show you that every claim Kerry made is not supported by the facts. If this reminds you of the Bay of Tonkin incident, which did not happen, but led to the unjustified escalation of the Vietnam War, you're making the right connection. I'll then turn the floor over to Jeremy, who will lead the Salon discussion on the larger questions he has raised about the suppression of this kind of information in the press and academic journals. I will, of course, participate in that discussion as needed. But let me repeat, however, that not one fact in the testimony you are about to see is correct. And I'll show you very quickly after I show you that testimony. Let me pull it up now. So I have the ability to share a screen here.
Our intelligence community has scrubbed and re-scrubbed the evidence. We have declassified unprecedented amounts of information, and we ask the American people and the rest of the world to judge that information. We have physical evidence of where the rockets came from and when. Not one rocket landed in regime-controlled territory. Not one. All of them landed in opposition-controlled or contested territory. We have a map, physical evidence, showing every geographical point of impact, and that is concrete. We are certain that none of the opposition has the weapons or capacity to effect a strike of this scale, particularly from the heart of regime territory. Just think about it in logical terms, common sense. So my colleagues, we know what happened. For all the lawyers, for all the former prosecutors, for all those who have sat on a jury, I can tell you that we know these things beyond the reasonable doubt that is the standard by which we send people to jail for the rest of their lives.
Okay. So let me emphasize, let me use the language that John Kerry used. Not one fact that he has claimed here is correct. So let me go and quickly show you. Here is the location, the locations in Zamalka, this suburb of Damascus, where we do know that this is where chemical impacts, rockets carrying chemicals landed. You can see it's an area of about 3/4 of a mile on a side. Well, the rockets looked exactly like this. Notice that there's a long rocket motor, and then you can see that there was something on the front end and pieces of skin from a barrel that's filled with sarin. My colleague Dick Lloyd and I were the first to figure out what this munition looked like. We were ahead of the UN and ahead of the White House because we sent our data to the White House Science Advisor's Office, and they clearly did not know what this munition looked like until we sent the information. What it was is a rocket, a typical artillery rocket. I'll show you what that looks like shortly, which had a barrel carrying about 50 liters, 50 liters of sarin in it. We also know, although the UN was not sure that the barrels were full, we did an analysis on the flight stability of this rocket, and we determined that this rocket would tumble end over end unless the barrel was full. So we knew more than the UN about the characteristics of this rocket. Here just gives you a feeling for what the artillery rocket from which this munition is derived. Typical artillery rocket has these rocket motors. There's a warhead, and then there's a venturi, a nozzle that goes on the back. And what they did, what the attackers did, is they replaced the nozzle with their own nozzle, and they put this barrel on, in which the barrel had a cavity that was cylindrically shaped. The rocket motor went up through the cylinder, and that was the barrel rocket that I'll be referring to from now on. We have a lot of data on the characteristics of the rocket, so there's nothing strange or secret. No special intelligence involved except the kind that's called intellect. This is a trajectory calculation we did to assure ourselves that we understood the characteristics of this rocket. That's this rocket up here. And then we did a calculation with the barrel rocket attached to it. Notice that it was a 2-kilometer range. It's actually closer to 2 than 2.5 kilometers. And the reason the range is so short is, first of all, the barrel weighs like 120 pounds of sarin in it. So it's a lot of weight relative to the warhead that was carried on the early rocket. The other factor that played a big role was the fact that the cylinder is a flat face, and there's a tremendous amount of aerodynamic drag. If you didn't have that aerodynamic drag, the cylinder would have gone 4 or maybe 4.5 kilometers. So aerodynamic drag played a big role in this. So, but we know it's 2-kilometer range. Nobody has disputed that. The UN did an independent calculation, and they actually agreed with our finding. Now, what's relevant here is that this kind of rocket has been seen before, different forms of it. This, for example, is it's called an overcaliber rocket. Here is the warhead. Someone went out and stuck an artillery rocket motor in it, and they were able to get a range of about 1 kilometer. This was seen a lot in Vietnam. So once we discovered this and I started talking to people, I talked to a couple of people who were retired from the intelligence community. One of them, actually, my brother-in-law. And he said, oh, yeah, we saw this kind of thing all the time in Vietnam. So the point is that these were not technically trained people, but they had the experience of seeing this, and they knew immediately, instantly, that this was a shorter range rocket. I did not know this, neither did Dick, because we actually did the first principal calculation, and we were surprised by what we found. But the intelligence people we talked to, who were experienced, knew immediately that this couldn't be a 10-kilometer range missile. All right, so here is the map that was published with the intelligence report that Kerry was referring to, and he referred to this map. Here is the Syrian government controlled area, and here is the area where the chemicals landed. I'll show you next. This is the range of 2 kilometers that we know this rocket is only capable of. This is the range of over 10 kilometers or more that was clearly implicit in the claims being made by Kerry. This shows you where the munitions landed. Here's just a blow up for you to see. That's the original area, and it's just projected onto the intelligence map. And this shows you the area from which these munitions had to be launched. They could not be launched outside this circular area. They just didn't have the range. So when you look at the regime-controlled areas, it's clear that the rockets could not have possibly come from regime-controlled areas, not due to legal arguments, not due to shenanigans and falsification, due to physics. So here you have an extremely simple fact of physics that can't be called manipulation. So what do we know? What do we know? Well, first of all, we now know that the White House intelligence report was amateurish and unprofessional. There were inconsistencies in it that should have been caught by any professional who was involved. We also know that the UN, the New York Times, and Human Rights Watch knew or had to know that the White House intelligence report was wrong. They took no action to correct the false story, but more importantly, they took no action to investigate the matter. Talk about investigative reporting having a problem. If you found out that this was the case, your first question would be, wow, we almost got into a war. What happened? No questions at all from the press, New York Times among them. Kerry's claim that the intelligence report was scrubbed for accuracy can't be true. If there was any well-trained, knowledgeable intelligence analyst who looked at this, they would have said immediately, like I did, and I'm not an intelligence analyst, there's something wrong here. It's obvious that there were no knowledgeable members of the US intelligence community involved, or they were suppressed. I think there's some reason to believe from details that people may have had questions, but were told to shut up. The claims that and this is really important because this is absolutely solid physical claim. The claim that US satellites observed the rocket launches is obviously false. The launch locations did not occur in Syrian government-controlled areas. The range of the rockets was just simply too small. Rockets couldn't possibly have come from these areas. The claim that the impact points were seen from satellites is also false and ridiculous because these rockets had no explosive warhead. So you could have been on the ground in Zamalka where the attack occurred. You would have heard a thud on the ground. It was a dark night. You might not have even been able to see where this thud had occurred if it had occurred 10 meters away from you. You wouldn't have known this. And let me tell you, if you wouldn't have known this, no satellite would be able to pick it up from geosynchronous orbit. All right, so who's responsible for this? And I don't have an answer here, but I just raised some questions for you to think about. First of all, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, is clearly the most responsible individual for this fiasco. Why do we have a Director for National Intelligence if this guy couldn't figure this out? Where was the President's science advisor? We're supposed to have a science advisor, John Holdren. Others were also surely involved. John Kerry was either duped or did not know the intelligence was false. And when you look at the record of Kerry screaming about this, he obviously did not do any kind of judicious looking at the intelligence. He was screaming before the president had a decision about this. Ben Rhodes, this deputy national security advisor, claims to have written the White House intelligence report with the help of the deputy director of national intelligence. What were these guys doing? The deputy director of national intelligence doesn't have enough knowledge of our own sensing systems to say, wait a second, you can't see things that don't emit light. What did the president know? It's very clear from what I now know. I'm absolutely sure he knew nothing. The president was completely misinformed, and Clapper seemed to know that something may not be right because he reversed himself at some later time. But we don't really know what we do know. He's caught lying by the Congress on other matters. And the real big question for me is, where is the press analysis and reporting on this? There is none. You'd think that a press that claims to be interested in doing investigative reporting would see this gaping hole and say, what is going on here? So I just have two questions. As a person who worked as a senior advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, and often found myself saying, wait a second, I don't understand this. Explain it to me. When I talk to the intelligence people, and then find out that what they're saying is nonsense, and then going and telling the chief that it's nonsense. I have to ask myself, as a professional who could have been in a position on a White House staff, God help them all, what's the purpose of having a director of national intelligence and a science advisor in the White House if they don't know the most basic things about our intelligence systems? I'll just stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Ted.
Is this the question and answer session, John, or is there more?
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce. Kick it off.
Just a couple of things. Today's press revealed purportedly that Israel attacked additional chemical weapons production sites in Syria. In fact, they're very, very long article in the Washington Post. And I'd like you to evaluate, is that just a continuation of what you've just presented with regard to distortions? And the media won't publish anything that criticizes Israel. And that kind of leads me to my second question. You'll notice that the New York Times has done extensive reporting on these bombings in Afghanistan that the military lied about and saying they didn't kill any civilians. And then they said, well, maybe there were civilians, but we had good reason to think they were not. It doesn't look like it was investigative reporting, precisely the type that has not happened in Syria. Is that because our media, as well as our foreign policy, is driven by concerns for Israel?
First of all, I don't know the answer to either of your questions, but let me just comment, explain. It's certainly possible that there is an effort in Syria to rebuild, nerve agent capabilities. I don't know. I think from the report, there's no way of knowing, because the Washington Post article, because it's just a person repeating a story. Is the story technically ridiculous? No. I mean, they're going after certain chemicals. I'm familiar with some of those chemicals because I'm not a chemist, but I've looked into how you manufacture sarin, because it helps to know the details. And it's possible. Who knows? Does it mean that they got the right target? No. We only know what we've been told, and the Israelis, frankly, only know what they think they know. So this could be entirely false, although not necessarily due to intent to mislead, although that could be the outcome. The question, this then brings me to the question of what happened, this horrifying, awful situation in Kabul, which, because of an accident of my situation, I knew that the report made by the US government, probably within a few hours of the attack, I knew that what the US government was reporting was false. And the reason for that is I got a phone call from some people at the Washington Post, and they wanted to know my opinion about the scene. And I said, I don't know anything about it. You have to send me some photographs or some video. And then within about 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of looking at the videos and I could tell immediately that there was only a single munition that went in. There were no secondary explosions, as they claimed. And it was a clean single shot on a single vehicle. And that if there were people in that courtyard, they were dead, because the munition involved, I know a little bit about it, it's very carefully and well designed to throw shrapnel for a good distance, and anybody within about 30 yards of that thing was killed. Now, the interesting thing from my point of view, which is different from the question you're asking, but I think it's worth pointing out, is Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, did not know that this attack was not as it was claimed to be for almost 2 weeks. I knew just by looking at photographs sent to me by the Washington Post within an hour or two. He needed 2 weeks of all kinds of people supposedly investigating the matter before he actually got the information he needed to say, oh, I guess it was a terrible mistake. So what does this say about our intelligence system, our system of reporting? What does it say about the senior people who accept this intelligence? I can tell you, when I was at the Pentagon, and the intelligence, I was advising the chief of naval operations. So the intelligence people come to me and they're going to tell me they want the chief to know something. And I would say, well, show me. You know, I'm from Missouri, show me. And some of the time it was real. But a good deal of the time, it was totally invented nonsense. And why don't these people have experts surrounding them? Why doesn't Miller have a very smart scientist from one of the national laboratories, for example, who's got a lot of technical background, who can go and ask all the right questions immediately? Why does he wait for this cumbersome bureaucracy, which doesn't know what it's doing, to screw up its courage to say they screwed up? And this is the same situation we see at the White House in this particular case. None of these people involved in the White House for the Damascus situation, even today, know that they did not get an accurate intelligence report. They still think it will happen, including Kerry. That's serious. That's, you know, we almost got into a serious military engagement that could have escalated into all kinds of things over this. And these people don't even know now, 8 years later, that they didn't get an accurate picture of what happened. And they're not curious. To me, that's even more shocking. They're not curious to say, okay, wow, I got the wrong information, but gee whiz, thanks for telling me. None of that. They don't want to know. Anyway, sorry.
One point I can add maybe on the media is that, well, the media, the New York Times did expose this bombing in, I think, Baghouz, where they killed at least 60 or 70 civilians.
Yes, they did that, and that was a good job.
Yeah. I mean, it showed they have the capability, firstly. And secondly, I don't know, maybe the pattern is that they're willing to acknowledge, you know, some excesses, but the issue we're addressing here with the chemical weapons attack gets to the question of why the U.S. is even there. You know, there any legitimacy to the war itself? I mean, you can criticize certain excesses of this bombing was wrong, but if you challenge the Syria chemical warfare and start to get, you know, look more critically at the Assad government, the politics about it, then people would really question why the U.S. has any reason to be there at all, not just maybe criticizing certain excesses of the policy. And I think you see that as a pattern of the media. They very rarely, occasionally they will, historically in Vietnam they did, other wars maybe a little bit, they will occasionally report on certain excesses of the military. But when it comes down to key incidents that justify the war, that's where I think you get a lot more censorship or reluctance to do the real investigative work. And even Afghanistan, the media never reported that the Taliban were willing to hand over bin Laden, that their emissaries who said that they would have handed him over. And, you know, that starts to question why the U.S. had any business in Afghanistan in the first place. The Times never reported that stuff.
Well, I have my take on motivations to follow up again on Bruce's very good questions, but hard to answer, is my feeling. I underscore it's a feeling because it's based on my experience, but I haven't analyzed it. I don't have the tools. I'm not a sociologist. But my feeling is that people really hate Assad. And, you know, quite frankly, he's not a lovable guy. So, and, you know, his behavior like the behavior of the people he's fighting, is awful. Nobody comes out looking good in that war. And so people have decided they hate the Assad regime, and hence he must be guilty for anything awful that happens. And I've got news for them. You know, people who get on television and cut off the heads of journalists to show you that they mean business are not nice people. They're not seeking democracy. They're not seeking an open society. This is a bad place where a lot of bad actors are involved. So I come there and I have this analysis. It's a stupid physicist, it doesn't look like he did it, just that simple. You can't, there's no way it could happen physically. Oh, you're an Assad, you're apologist for war crimes. Literally, I got called an apologist for war crimes when I was giving a talk in London by this character Higgins. So, I mean, it's like, let's go out and hang somebody and make sure we pick the right person. In the South, it would be a person who's black. Somewhere else, it might be an Arab. Somewhere else, it might be a Jew. Let's go out and hang somebody and tell ourselves we're doing justice. So that's the way it appears to me, but I could be wrong.
Good. Who has some questions?
Could I, Peter Ford here in England. Good evening, everyone. I wonder, could this operation possibly have been mounted without the support from a Western intelligence or military agency? I'm not a weapons expert, but it seems to me, I am a former ambassador to Syria, not entirely ignorant, but I would speculate that there was definite involvement by a Western agency to make this operation technically possible.
Well, I think the long pole in the tent, if you're not a nation state, for the kind of attack that occurred in Damascus, is obtaining the enormous amounts of sarin. You can make sarin in your kitchen if you're probably kill yourself, but if you know what you're doing, you might not kill yourself. But you can't make large quantities of that easily. So the question is, where did this come from? Now, the evidence that I have strongly suggests that it was not the Syrian government, but we don't know. Maybe someone stole something from the Syrian government and the rebels used it. Maybe someone sold it from Syrian government. Now, if you listen to Sy Hirsch, and I think Sy is right, just to be clear, but it's not my work, it's Hirsch's work. Sy told me, and I know he's written about it, so he told me that a CIA...
He's on, Ted, he's listening to you. So.
Okay, he's listening. Oh, Sy, my God, I don't want to listen. So Sy should jump in, but Sy told me that he had a contact at the CIA who told him that the Turks were giving precursor chemicals and training to al-Nusra, if I got it right. So I jump in and tell me I'm stupid. But so, and when I heard that, I couldn't imagine, it was like I couldn't imagine something so stupid, or what appeared so stupid. But if you look at this guy Erdogan, another sort of charming character in the region, he would like to reinstate the Ottoman Empire in some form or other, and Syria used to be part of it. And he, if he could knock the Syrian government out and somehow use Turkish forces to move into that space, it would be a good thing, I think, from his point of view. But Sy, why don't you come in here and tell me why I'm wrong? Quiet for a change.
He just stood up. I don't know.
Okay. So we don't know where the sarin came from.
So I will be back to defend himself.
it's not implausible that the way you mix this kind of sarin, first of all, Cy has told me, again, it's Cy's knowledge, not mine, that Porton Down has been lying about the source of the sarin. So that they found that the sarin did not match the Syrian sarin, because they know what they look like. The way you mix sarin is you mix, there are two chemicals. One's very, very, very hard to get, and the other is very easy to get. So what you do is you get this material, it's methyl phosphonic difluoride. It's very, very hard to manufacture, which is what this article in the Washington Post was about, is a precursor chemicals they were talking about to making this methyl phosphonic difluoride. When you have this stuff, it's relatively stable, but if you mix isopropyl alcohol, which is ubiquitous, with it, you get sarin. You also get hydrofluoric acid, which is not nice stuff. You know, that's the stuff you use to etch glass. So you put other stuff in it, isopropyl amine in it, to suck up the material. So you got to know how to mix it without killing yourself. And somebody knew how to do this in large quantities. There must have been some amount that maybe it came from Iraq, because the Iraqis had it. Maybe there were people who filtered into these extremist Islamic groups who had the expertise. I don't know, but that's the long pole. The rocket, the barrel rocket itself is trivial to make. You heard these so-called experts talking about the difficulties of building. This guy Higgins doesn't even know how a rocket works. I've talked to him. He doesn't even understand the principles of impulse and momentum. But I can tell you, because I, as a graduate student, built my own equipment. I could have built that rocket. No sweat at all. And so all you need is a machine shop to do it. And there are plenty of machine shops in Syria and elsewhere where you see them manufacturing munitions. So the long thing, on the long pole in the tent, was getting the sarin. That's the really tough stuff.
Could I,
go ahead.
Jeremy and Ted both, was Libya in some sense a dress rehearsal for Syria? That being that the administration claimed there was on the verge of genocide that Gaddafi was going to commit, and that's what forced them to take action immediately. Although Leon Panetta, in his memoir, just said Gaddafi was a bad guy, so we got to get rid of him somewhere or other. But was the excuse similarly flimsy in Libya, just to see how much they could get away with, and they just told to fly in Syria?
I not only do not know what these guys know and think, I don't even know if they think. It turns out, again, this is Cy Hirsch. I'm surprised he's not yelling at me here, because he always calls me Bubala. What happened, Benghazi was being used as a port by Petraeus, who was then CIA director, another genius, to export Libyan arms to the rebels in Syria through Turkey. And so what was going on there is the United States got it in its head that somehow these rebels, like al-Nusra, they convinced themselves that somehow they could control them because they wanted to bring down the Assad regime, which they considered extreme. You know, when you hear about these things, you say to yourself, what can I believe at all? You know, so I don't know what Gaddafi was up to doing. And I don't believe anything these people say.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think with Libya, one of the deception was they were playing up this alleged massacre at the Abu Salim prison. They claim, because Obama gave a speech on the eve of the Libya bombing where he claimed Gaddafi massacred 1,000 people just in one day. He said something to that effect. And it was a vague reference to this massacre of the prison in Benghazi, where there had been an Islamic rebellion in the prison. However, the facts surrounding that case, maybe Ted should look into that, because the facts are very murky as far as what happened. Then they claimed after, Libya was Benghazi was liberated, that they found the mass grave. The rebel forces who took over allegedly found this grave, and then it turned out it was animal bones. And there's actually, it's very murky how many were killed. I mean, it's clear there was a prison uprising in the mid-90s, but it's not clear how many got killed, whether Gaddafi even ordered it or had anything to do with it. And so they claim he's this butcher who massacred, and they reference that particular prison when it's completely, again, murky. We don't really know what happened there. And they make like he ordered the killing of 10,000 or whatever they said. I think 1,200 was the figure they gave. So I think there's a parallel with Syria. They're kind of inventing stories to make this guy look like a monster, and we don't even know the facts about this case or if he had any involvement. And of course, they're presenting the rebels, as freedom fighters and liberal, out for liberal democracy. In both cases, I think it's the same. Is that like Benghazi was a headquarter of Al Qaeda and a headquarter of the Islamic opposition to Gaddafi, just like in Syria, the uprising from the beginning was led by Islamic elements, but the media kind of distorted that. And yeah, with the massacre, I don't think there's evidence that Gaddafi actually massacred any of the demonstrators. I think a lot of the massacres occurred after, and these Al Qaeda forces took over. They kind of cleansed the town and went after all the Gaddafi supporters. So, yeah, I think it's a good question. There are a lot of parallels. And unfortunately, I think the media, like unlike the Vietnam era, there's no real investigative reporting. And I think the anti-war movement has just fallen off. In Vietnam, there were a lot of people paying attention and starting demonstration, but they found a way to fight a war where no Americans are really affected. A very small number are in danger for their lives. So the public just kind of tunes out and believes what they say, or doesn't have the facts at their hands to contradict what the government is saying.
Do you think part of that, Jeremy, is because there's no congressional oversight anymore? There are no Fulbright kind of hearings. So the administration is never confront subpoenas and demands, that they can't walk away from to answer questions.
I think that's a big problem. Yeah, that's what I think Ray McGovern called the Mickey Matt, the military industrial congressional intelligence academia complex, and Congress had been completely bought off, so that you don't have these independents like McGovern or Fulbright to challenge what's going on. I mean, Dennis Kucinich, I think, challenged Obama on Libya. He was subject, I know, to surveillance and some kind of harassment, maybe not as bad as Ted, but there are a small number, I think, congressmen, and some are Republican, like Ron Paul and his son, who sometimes challenge, often on the legal dimensions. If the executive branch is waging war without congressional support, they're often raising that right away. So, I mean, there are a small number of congressmen, but they don't really have a platform, and they're not, leading hearings like in the Fulbright era, as you say. So, and the public is just not well informed. And I think a lot of the alternative media, like I was, watching Democracy Now! And these outlets that are supposed to be more independent reporting, that they do have a pretty wide audience, not as large as the New York Times, but and they're good on a lot of issues. But when it comes to Libya, Syria, they tend to repeat what the State Department says, and that, I think, diffuses people on the left who traditionally were among those leading the protests.
I think that the facts of the matter are that the cultural situation in many of these countries is not able to put together a central government that's democratic. It's the culture. It's like when I first came to Washington a long time ago, not now, because now it's different. I was amazed. I had a good friend who brought me in. I was a physicist scientist, and this guy worked for Congress. And he'd bring me to he'd go to some friend, we'd go out for dinner somewhere, and he'd have all his Republican, he was a Democrat, he had all his Republican and Democratic friends. Everybody was at the table disagreeing with each other. It was good-natured. They had honest debates. Nobody yelled at each other. It was really democracy. You just felt good about it, and it's no longer that way. And when you have a cultures that are tribal, just an accident of the history of the region, what happens is the tribe that's in control is the one that clamps down on everybody else. And, you know, if you want to get rid of Assad, the first question you should have is, who's going to replace him? And the people who replace him may be worse from your point of view, or maybe worse from the people's point of view. It's hard to know. I mean, these are very, very repressive societies, because there are many factions who do not recognize a central government as being legitimate. And, you know, no one should be surprised that there aren't, you know, that the people who are fighting from one end are not, you know, Benjamin Franklin and his buddies. Maybe Peter Ford will correct me on this, but that's the way it looks to me. Ambassador, would you tell me I'm wrong?
No, Ted, you're as always right. Just want really, I just tuned in to express my admiration for what you've done over a period of years now. Your contribution was one of the things that kept me going in my modest attempt to influence the debate on Syria, a hopeless effort by and large, but we must all continue the fight. Yes, to try to impose a Western democratic model on societies like Syria is pure illusion. In no time, as we saw in 2011, you get maybe some sprouting of what were interpreted at the time as democratic sprouts coming up, but grassroots level. But in no time, the movement was taken over by sectarians, given the demographics of Syria. Syria is divided by religion. Fortunately, for many years, it's had a secular-minded sort of government who have banged heads together, and people have rubbed along pretty well. But then you get people like the Muslim Brothers who come along in the 1980s and try to create a Sunni supremacy. They're beaten down, but don't go away, just go underground. Then they get an opportunity, helped by the West, in 2011 with the Arab Spring, and they pop up again, and more jihadis pile in from outside. And for me, the best interpretation of the Syrian conflict is that it's been a war for the Sunni supremacy. Sunnis with their Western allies.
Yeah. If I could just comment, Ted, your observation, I think that's why in the United States, despite the pluralism that we survived for so long, because we had separation of powers or checks and balances that didn't depend upon personalities to secure our liberty. The whole idea that he has was, since men aren't angels, they're more likely to be devils. We need to have ambition counteract ambition. And that was the reason why power was diffused. You don't find any diffusion of power anywhere in the Middle East or Africa. It's all executive centrist. The legislative branches are virtually invisible. At best, they're ornamental. And that shows most of them haven't been able to embrace, Madison's wisdom that you can't expect angels to be lusting for power. They're going to be, by self-definition, self-selection, people who are narcissistic, in some sense, egomaniacal, and you have to build your legal architecture accordingly. And that simply hasn't been done, in the Middle East or Africa. And the day Arab Spring began, I said to all my colleagues, nothing's going to change, because they know what they're against, but they don't know how to change the personality dimension of power. And until they understand checks and balances, it's just going to come back with new choreography, but the same despotism, which unfortunately is exactly what has happened. And we see it now even in Tunisia.
Let's hope we don't see it next in the United States.
It's coming. We have, and this is our president. Date, July 23rd, 2019. And then I have Article 2, where I have the right to do anything I want as president. Quoted Donald J. Trump. And he tried to do that on January 6th, among other times.
Yes.
That's our president.
Akko, would you like to jump in here? Or someone asked.
I don't have much of a question.
Go ahead.
Maybe it is
Todd.
for Ted. And perhaps you know Noam Chomsky some.
Yeah.
Manufacturing consent. I just posted in the chat room and I came across a document. I engaged in continuous research project on what it is that low intensity conflict and PSYOPs and all this stuff is doing, because that's what I used to be in, besides a Guantanamo defense attorney, where it was done to an art form by the military commission's prosecutors. But anyway, I just come across this document by an Israeli think tank on cognitive campaigns. And I've been reading about mass consciousness activities and of how, you know, in the United States, we call it perception management. And our think tanks have taken these techniques, which if you read about the coups from the 1960s, you can see was originated with the CIA, on how to, you know, change the consciousness of populations. And I think the whole campaign against Syria was a masterful cognitive mass consciousness activity. I just wonder if that's any part of your research, and maybe for Cy Hirsch as well, who would have been involved in these issues. I mean, this is taken to a much higher level than we ever saw during Vietnam, to a new state-of-the-art form.
Well, keep in mind that I'm, you know, I'm trained as a physical scientist. I don't claim to know nothing about politics, but I want to caution. I'm far from the most sophisticated person to ask this question. But what I have been very worried about over the last 10 years now is the fact that we have organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, the Atlantic Council, the Brits have some similar organizations, funding totally fraudulent people. This guy, Elliot Higgins, is a good example of it. The guy is totally ignorant. I mean, he just doesn't know anything. It's not that he's not educated, because I come from a community where I knew many people. I came from an immigrant community, and there were many people who were not formally educated, who were just tremendously smart. But this guy has no intellect. He has no interest in learning. His only interest is in spreading some kind of story. And the story has to comply in one way or another with the kinds of stories that the people who are supporting him are wants to see promulgated. So we have the CIA and other organizations, maybe not directly. Bruce might find that, you know, they're not allowed to do this because of this law or that law, but indirectly they're funneling all kinds of money to people who are not independent to make the case. What they're arguing, they're there to make the case against the Russian propaganda, the such and such propaganda, whoever, the Chinese propaganda, you know, all these imagined threats. And we have a society that's part of the reason why people can't believe anything, because the newspapers there are only a few serious newspapers left. The editors at some of these newspapers are totally illiterate. I mean this. You look at the New York Times, where, you know, I mean, I know a lot of people in the Times, you know, so, you know, over many years. Some of these people are totally illiterate when it comes to technical stuff. And, you know, technical is not the whole world. There's a lot of stuff that's political and social. You don't need to be technical to understand. But you know, when you publish an article like Sanger, this guy Sanger publishes, where he's got 6 North Korean ICBMs, all of which are mock-ups that we, you know, those of us who are watching, and you know, he's talking about them. They're diagrams. It's all fabricated. Who's the editor who's letting him do this? It's ultimately the editors. So I don't know, you know, what to tell you, but there is a high level of illiteracy in the journalism community. A lot of these people are very well educated. If you talk to them about the books they've read, you know, I was in a department which actually was mostly humanities people because it was science, technology, and society. You can't believe how little some of these people know about science. You got to know something about science if you're talking about a subject that has a social dimension, but has also got a scientific basis. They don't know anything, and they don't care. So I don't know what to tell you, but I think that's a trend we're seeing in American society and globally as well.
I think, Ted,
I see John Huss.
Well, I would just add briefly that I think very effective in co-opting the alternative media, because I followed that carefully on like Syria and Libya. That, you know, magazines that started as kind of muckraking journals like Mother Jones or down the gamut, they're often you know, leading the way and kind of playing up the human rights abuse of Assad or Gaddafi to build momentum for military intervention on human rights grounds. And sometimes you see the most hawkish people are identified as liberal or even leftist. So that may be a crucial part of the to diffuse the anti-war movement by infiltrating the alternative media that, like in the Vietnam era, like you had Ramparts and independent journal that were very critical of the Vietnam War and anti-establishment. And now they still have that veneer, but they've been co-opted on these issues. So I think that's the work of intelligence agencies have probably planted people in there to advance this narrative. And that serves to diffuse the you know, certain segment of the US population that's more, I guess, on the left or anti-establishment, that's silent and as often attacking people like Ted or others as Assad lovers or whatever words they use.
But you have a man sitting in what's supposed to be a crater caused by a bomb filled with sarin a few hours after this bomb supposedly hit the ground. And he's wearing a face mask like you and I would wear if we were going into a hospital. And he's not dead. And people don't ask the question, what's going on here? You know, I mean, it doesn't take, I mean, I have friends who do, I've been very lucky to know a bunch of diplomats over my career. And one of the wonderful things I've been able to do with these diplomat friends is they come to me and they ask me questions. They say, I'm not expert in it. They're tremendously knowledgeable about the things they're, you know, the political side of things. And when something comes up that's technical, they ask me a question, and it's great. I love the service that I'm able to perform. But they're the ones, so they're not stupid, but you see the press, you look at what these guys are publishing. They have a photograph of the guy sitting in a sarin filled, according to them, a sarin filled hole, and he's not dead. I mean, you know, it's just incredible. How can you publish that and not ask the question, what's going on here? It's just hard to believe.
Well, I think Ted and Jeremy, I think that you're maybe overlooking that we have now reached a truly Orwellian world of 1984 proportions. The goal of speaking by the government is not to discuss truth, is to paint a narrative to justify the multi-trillion-dollar military industrial security complex. And you are operating on the idea that everyone seriously is searching for truth without ulterior motives. The government never acts without ulterior motives. Never. They come up with a narrative and they say, how can we manufacture facts to get in there, or at least purport to manufacture? And they don't care. You mentioned James Clapper. I was there in a hearing. My friend Ron Wyden, senator. This was oversight of the National Security Agency. And Wyden asked him, are you collecting data on millions of Americans? This is at the time they're collecting data on every one of us. And he said, no, under oath. Nothing ever happened to him. He gets promoted. So it's very difficult, to criticize, a government against truth when they say in response, that's not our goal. Your yardstick is not the yardstick we use. Anything that helps us justify the military industrial complex and go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, we'll describe as truth. Who cares? We have the money and the political contributions on our side.
Could I make an observation? It concerns our, I would argue, relative success in puncturing the Pentagon's narrative and London's narrative.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. Do I have the floor? You hear me?
Yes.
Making an observation, or maybe it's a question, I think that we've been fairly successful in puncturing the narrative of the establishment. We have created a situation where if there is another fake flag attack, there'll be a lot of eye rolling. And a lot of people will say, oh, here we go again. And this is a very important role that I believe that people like Professor Postol have played. We have been an important dragging anchor or thorn in the side. We have succeeded in puncturing the narrative sufficiently that they haven't repeated it for 2 or 3 years now, and would find it probably hard to repeat today.
I think I would not disagree with anything you've said, Ambassador. I just make the observation that none of the people involved in these lies ever get sanctioned. Nothing ever happens to them. They know, okay, the deterrence is zero, at least with regard to their professional careers. I say James Clapper got promoted after he committed perjury. So that's the difficulty. And I think you're right. The American people oftentimes say, oh, it's another lie, but nothing ever happens and doesn't change. Still, what drives the policy is still the false narrative that the government touts, even though the public thinks it's wrong. But hey, the government's the government. It moves forward, and Congress does absolutely nothing. And we keep going further and further off of the cliff. And it's not going to be long before we start to fall.
And I think they're all, I agree with most of what you said too, Ambassador, except I think they are still doing it, like with China. Now it's the Uyghur genocide, and the situation there is a lot more complex than just like Syria, but they want to advance this very simplified good versus evil narrative. They're doing the same thing with Russia. They've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it does work. Sadly, they are quite sophisticated, and somehow they seem to succeed in getting, although more skeptical. I think you're right, because of the work of different people like Ted and others. But I think there's still a huge amount of the public, even the educated public, that still falls for this and still supports the latest crusade, like against China or Russia. Now I think the moves away from the Middle East. People are tired of Middle East wars, but the new target of Russia, I think, and China, and that's the Pentagon strategy of great power competition.
I'm sorry.
Pat, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go.
Pat Malloy.
I just want to, we mentioned the think tanks. There was a fellow named Jim Mann who was with the Los Angeles Times in Shanghai for many years. He's now over at Johns Hopkins. But he wrote a book about 10 years ago called The China Fantasy. And I think in the early page, I recall quite well, he said, we have these peculiar institutions in Washington called think tanks who seem to think the thoughts of those who fund them. Okay, so I do think there ought to be more attention paid to who's funding these people and getting it out to the public. The problem is, I used to respect newspapers like the Post and the Times, but these papers were very much behind the Iraq. I mean, they built up the country to invade Iraq. They played a role in that whole, and now I see they're driving a policy of maybe intervening in Ukraine. What is going on in our press that these people are driving a message rather than just telling the truth of facts? That they all seem to want to drive policy rather than tell you what's really going on.
Molly, do you want to?
Okay. So I want to agree with what Pat just said. I think there is been a problem. It continues. The media is in bed with its sources. That's the way you operate as a reporter. You don't know story if your sources don't talk to you. And for the Washington Post, and even more for the New York Times, the sources are the State Department, the people at the very top of the totem pole on these issues. And you can see the record of this playing out. They are leaders of the pack when it comes to war. They are. I'm sorry. It's just a fact. But it goes back to, you can't burn your sources because you have no story if you have no sources. So there is a natural inclination to believe what they're telling you. And if the people who have an opposite point of view can't make their case effectively or don't speak, then you are only left with the government's point of view. And it's very hard to tell the man in the street that the government's wrong. They tend to want to believe traditionally the government is the good guy, even when they're not. So as a reporter, you have a problem anytime you have a story that questions what the government is doing. One, because you burn your sources, and second, because it doesn't have credibility with the man in the street in the same way. So that would be my experience and what I think is part of the problem.
John, if I could just share, this is not directly involved with the scientific things that Ted and Jeremy have discussed here, but I have communicated literally on 20 occasions with the New York Times and Washington Post when they write this false narrative that the NATO treaty obligates us to go to war if any member is subject to aggression. That is clearly false if you read the NATO treaty, and this is confirmed by then Secretary of State Dean Acheson when he was testifying in favor of the committee. No, only Congress can take us to war, and that we just have to respond in our constitutional fashion. They refuse to publish any of that ever. They want to promote the myth, oh, under Article 5, we are obligated to go to war, and that's why we have to stick with that. And if we walk away from that pledge, all of Western Europe and Eastern or Central Europe will fall to Russia and things like that. It doesn't matter. I send them the text. I send them Dean Acheson's testimony. It's in the congressional record. Nothing. No response. They will not touch that.
Well, Bruce, you just don't understand. You're a crank.
Yeah, right.
Can I say a word about this? I've been listening to this. I happen to be on the same magazine as Jeremy, Covert Action magazine. But it seems to me that the conversation circles around the idea that we should expose falsehoods, lies, and then the government, some element of the government will do something about it. The Justice Department will institute a lawsuit, or the Congress will investigate. That's not going to happen anymore. Government is too tightly populated with people whose career opportunities matter more, or whose dirty laundry that they don't want uncovered. the only way that this is going to stop is if the legal system changes in a certain way, which shouldn't have to change, where citizens have standing to bring suit against the government for damage it causes. Now, there should be no reason why, if a government leader lies and thereby causes a war that kills members of my family or destroys my income or does something else that's terrible, that I shouldn't have standing to sue that leader or the government. But courts at this point do not allow you to have standing. I know Chris Hedges even tried to sue the government over something that he claimed damaged them, and they did not judge on the basis of merits. They simply said he has no standing and they're going to dismiss the case. So until the citizen of the United States has standing to bring a suit in court against its leaders, nothing is going to change. We will have incremental differences. We'll throw this or that person in jail, maybe, but by and large, nothing will change. That's something that should be worked on by not only this group, which may not have the power to do so, but in general, the legal profession itself should rise up and demand this. The courts can change that at any time. And then you would see a government that could approach the democratic ideals that we supposedly live by.
It's not quite so simple. The Supreme Court and other courts have said standing is a mandate of Article 3. That's not subject to congressional change. That's its jurisprudence, I know, goes back 200 and some years. You have to amend the Constitution if you're complying with Supreme Court doctrine in order to endow citizens with standing of the type that you've described. So that's, and whether you could get an amendment, I think it's highly unlikely. But I'm not disagreeing with the general idea. I think that since war destroys every citizen's livelihood, every citizen ought to have standing. But that's so far removed from the current jurisprudence, it wouldn't pass the laugh test.
Well, that's what I said. The courts decided that citizens don't have standing. Anytime the Supreme Court could find any number of rationales to incrementally creep that in, the same way Brown versus Board of Education was a result of countless incremental decisions that finally allowed the major decision to be made. But the Supreme Court won't do it. It's not in their interest. They are not a political body, and they never were.
Bruce,
Right. Bruce, are a political body.
Bruce, this is Mike. Can I just raise an issue?
Sure.
Why don't we adopt a model like the Texas model, where citizens can just sue? You know, I'm serious. I mean, it's good for the goose. It's good for the gander. You know,
Yep.
Screw them.
Yeah,
That's what Newsom is talking about doing with guns and gun rights. Go ahead.
Well, I think that the Texas law has already been invalidated even by the Texas state courts. And if you read closely, even the last Supreme Court decision this week, they're going to throw the whole thing out. It's a matter of when rather than if.
Okay.
So pass muster.
Yeah.
Bruce, do you want to address it's an Article 1 solution, not an Article 3? You want to...
Yeah, the fact is that Congress has the authority to roll back all of the lies and the abuses that we've described today. The legal architecture is the same. It's simply a lack of political will that has evaporated over the last 50 years. Just to give one example, you see how the January 6th Commission is struggling with these claims of executive privilege. They're going to court, which will take years before they finally resolve the claims. You know what happened with the Justice Department working on impeachment against Nixon? He defied 4 subpoenas. Trump defied hundreds. 4 subpoenas. The House Judiciary Committee did not go to court. They said, all right, you're obstructing our function. We're impeaching you. That was Article 3 of the impeachment articles that would have led to his conviction if he didn't resign. Nixon didn't resign earlier. And now, and I have written so many times to the commission, to members, you have inherent congressional power to impeach as a remedy for flouting a congressional subpoena. Impeachment doesn't go either before the courts or the executive branch. It's self-help. And it's been vindicated by Supreme Court decisions, McGrain and Dougherty, amongst others. And they simply won't do that. They simply won't do that. And think of the really absurdity of having a January 6th commission investigate the riot, and they're not even subpoenaing Trump and Pence, who were at the center of this whole insurrection, not even subpoenaing them. So if Congress doesn't have any will, even when you give them the authority to rectify the disaster, it'll just stay dormant. It's quite unfortunate, unless the American people vote them out of office. So they're not doing that, at least at present.
Well, Ted and Jeremy, we want to thank you very much for what you've done. Ted, for you taking all the time to, you must have spent thousands of hours analyzing all this, and Jeremy, for you to step in and where the mainstream media is falling down, you stood in the breach. So we want to celebrate you both and thank you again, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here with you guys.
Yeah,
thank you.
Not say that as Vice Chair for the set the standards which all respect.
Thank you very much for being yourselves.
All I can say is it's very nice to be in a group of cranks.
Thank you.
Good.
like Galileo and Kepler, right?
Right. Right.